business has been around ages, and the all sorts of stories, apocryphal or true, get told. But allegedly, it was founded by your uncle, J.B. Edgerton. Is that true? Does he really exist?
Yes, absolutely true, Tony. He did, and I thought it might be just a useful, interesting thing for you all if I just did a little bit of medieval history. Did anyone do medieval history at university? Because medieval history only actually in this case goes back to about 1906, which is quite a while before CPM got going. But in fact, it was the day that, or the year that a man called Bede Edgerton, the Venerable Bede Edgerton, was born. He was born in 1906. Born in 1904. My mother, who was his sister, was born a couple of years later, and my mother died about 4 years ago at the age of 102, up in Brill, where we currently live. So the office has always been very handy for work for me. So anyway, Bede was left school at 16. He went apparently to about half a dozen schools between the age of 6 and 16. They were private schools where fees were charged, but his father never paid the bill, so he was ejected, and so he just moved from school to school to school. And finally, at the age of 16, he thought, I've had enough of this, and so off he went and started work. And he started work in the post room. He was quite a bright lad, and he started work in the post room of an advertising agency in London, and he worked his way up through the post room, and he was good. He was a very good analyst, actually, Tony. He was a good analyst. He had a good brain, and he worked his way up through the post room, and then he became a sort of junior in this, and then he became an account executive in the modern parlance. And then he finally, after moving agencies 2 or 3 times, most of those agencies, of course, have either now merged or are defunct one way or another, but they were quite big in their day. London Press Exchange, Macius, Lord and Thomas, agencies like this that probably wouldn't mean much to you now, but they were quite big. And he worked eventually as the account director on Hague Whisky, which was his biggest account, and whisky was a big business in those days, bigger than probably now, relatively. And he told me that the great slogan for Hague Whisky.
I don't expect many of these people have maybe heard of
Hague Whisky. Does it mean anything to you? Don't be vague. Ask for Hague. That was the great strapline for Hague Whisky, and apparently the agents, hundreds of customers of Hague all over the nation, wrote in and said, this is the slogan you should have. And the agency, of course, being sort of prima donnas, as all agencies are, said, oh, no, can't possibly have that, it's far too banal. After about, I think about 5 years, they said, this is ridiculous, we better have it. So that became the slogan. It lasted for about 40 years, and that was the great Hague Whisky thing. But anyway, that was that. Anyway, he, in about 1935, met an American, a young American. Maybe Omnicom ought to know this.
Yeah, maybe.
But he met a young American who had an idea for companies that needed more staff to take on auxiliary sales people. And this was totally revolutionary at that time. And they decided, the two of them, that they would start a company. So they registered a company called Counter Products Limited. Counter Products because basically the business was all about shops with counters. I mean, supermarkets didn't exist, self-service didn't exist, it was all counters.
And there were tens of thousands of small shops in those days.
Well, there were certainly in the 1950s 175,000 independent stores in the United Kingdom. That's in the UK. Because you see, there was no Tesco until the 70s, late 60s, when Tesco got going. So it was all independent stores, little mama papa shops, and that was it. Everybody shopped at one of those stores. So counter products, the key was the shop counter, getting your product in. It was all then, of course, about distribution, not about selling out. The word selling out and merchandising, I mean, that's all local history. But it was all about getting the stuff in, and it was down to the mamas and papas, the shopkeepers, to get it out. That was their job. As long as you got it in, that was it. Your job was done.
And I guess he realised that when he was spending his clients' money on advertising products and they weren't available, they weren't in distribution,
yes,
he was wasting the money.
And there you are, Tony. What was the first real slogan of CPM? It can't be bought if it isn't there. And that was his line. It can't be bought if it isn't there. Just the same today, really.
Today, yeah.
So nothing's really changed. It's just slightly different. Scales are different. So anyway, at 35, met this American, set up this little business, and then the American decided to go home. So he went back to the United States, and Bede then thought, okay, well, I'll give it a go. And he had one or two clients that were quite interested, and so he left the agency business and he started Counter Products Limited and got it going. What happened? 1939, outbreak, Second World War. Company died because it was a non-essential industry. Armaments were important, agriculture was important, but certainly selling products into stores was worthless. So what did Bede do?
Not many products to sell, of course.
There was nothing to sell, precisely. There was nothing to sell. So in 1939, Bede basically shut the place down. It just shut down automatically, and he went off and joined the War Office, and he was in the intelligence in the war, 1939 to 1946, and the company was just moribund in that time. Okay, he finished in the War Office, and then in 1946 tried to get started again. But in that immediate post-war period, there was no product of that sort, and everything was still rationed. It was not a case of selling it; it was a case of trying to buy it. It was absolutely a seller's market. And if you made anything, you could sell it. So it was really pretty tough. So from sort of 46, really, right through until 52, when 1952, Queen's coronation, year, confectionery came off rationing, and that was the beginning really of suddenly there was a vibrancy, and people were beginning to do things, and things were beginning to become available, and so the markets began to grow, and so he was back in business and battling away to develop the business, which happened really between into the 50s and through into the 60s, but it was still very small. And the only product, I actually have my letter of engagement here. But
when did you actually join?
I joined in 1959. I was quite a young lad. I was 23, I think, already married, and one child. So there you are. But quite interesting, because this is the original letterheading. It was then, by the way, company, he changed it, marketing was the great new phrase, so he changed the name of the company to Counter Products Marketing Limited, in brackets marketing, only in brackets. And underneath the letterheading are what the company did, and it was sales agents, and he had one or two agencies 4 products which he had exclusively. There was a orange juice, I think, from Florida. Marketing consultants. He was very good, actually, at that. He used to write the most incredibly long and convoluted proposals to people about how they should market their products, for which he charged them a fee. Retail and wholesale distribution specialists, and that was where basically what we basically made the money out of was actually in teams of people that went out and did what we were just talking about, selling products into the trade, into the retail trade. We did very little with the wholesale trade, quite honestly, but it was mostly retail. And that was the business. And of course, the business at that time was entirely male-dominated. And, you know, it was a very tough environment in which to work, really. We had 1 or 2 clients that still exist. I mean, we had clients, I think the first client he ever got pre-war was Mars. And Mars were working out of a shed in Slough then. It's a slightly bigger, bigger shed now. But of course, Forrest Mars, the original founder of the business, had 2 sons. He didn't get on with them very well, and he told one of them, right, he said, you and I are not going to see eye to eye. This was in the USA. So he said, look, you go to Europe, go to England. I think they might like the product over there. You can have England and whatever is that France or maybe Germany. You know, you do that. I'll stay over here in the US. And so Forrest Jr. came over to Slough with the great formula and started work. And CPM actually helped to launch the Mars bar, because that was all they had then, of course, in the sort of 36, 37, just pre-war. So it goes back quite a long way. And there were products like Bisto, Dureski Minor cigarettes, ever heard of them? Probably not. Bile Beans, ever heard of them? X-Lax, the chocolate laxative. Tony might need some of that.
Probably not.
But you know, those were the sort of products that we were selling as into the trade, and the teams we had then. It was only salesmen, because both Bede and his sales director, who was a chap called Douglas Moore, who he hated with a deep loathing. Bede used to get the business and say, Douglas, right, you know, you find the men, and then he'd complain bitterly when the men didn't produce the results that he thought and had told the client he was going to get. You know, he said, I'm sure we can get you this and this and this. And when, of course, we didn't quite get there was only one person to blame, and that was Douglas Moore, poor old Douglas.
I have to tell you all that, and this is sort of moving on, we'll come back. Richard used to do exactly the same thing. We used to dread it when Richard was going out to a client, because myself and colleagues then had to deliver what he thought. So it ran in the family. Anyway, so when did you actually? So so you joined the late 50s, and then didn't you leave and then come back again?
Yeah, I joined the company, and it was a complete accident. I mean, there was no great career path lined up, and you were going to do this. I had been working, in fact, in Birmingham, where I was born, with my father, having been to school, and I went to Cambridge, and I came out of Cambridge after he had done. I did national service in the Royal Marines as well, so that was what we all did then. That was that, and then I came out of Cambridge, worked in Birmingham for a while, and the company in Birmingham, my father's company, there was a little silversmith there, and it just wasn't big enough for us. I mean, it wasn't big enough for him and me, really. And we were sitting around the Christmas lunch table in 1958, I think, and my uncle, whose wife had died, and he came to lunch, and he was complaining bitterly that he was working far too hard, and he got nobody in the business to come and do all the legwork. And so by the end of lunch, I basically was recruited. And so I started on January the 1st, 1958 or 9, and carried his bag, really. You know, I was his gopher, and used to just, you know, where he went, I went, and I learned the business really with him. And he was quite a hard taskmaster. I mean, he was, you know. If you wrote, every letter that I wrote to a client had to be taken into him, and it was checked for grammar, and then the secretary was given the letter, and if she made a semblance of a mistake, and of course, no, it was all typewriters, you know, then, she made a semblance of a mistake, it was no question of Tipp-Xing it out, it was go back and do it again. So secretaries used to stay there until 7 o'clock at night, retyping and rewording and everything else. But in those days, you could post it in Oxford, because we were in Oxford then. You could post it in Oxford at 7:30 in Oxford, and it would be delivered the following morning in London or Edinburgh or Glasgow, or wherever it was. So things worked, even though there were no computers.
What about your transition to owning the business then? How did that happen?
Well, basically, Tony, what happened was I joined, as I said, in 1959, and I just instinctively loved the business. I mean, I really related to it, what we were trying to do. I enjoyed the cut and thrust of it. It was terrific. I loved getting, you know, new business was brilliant. I must just, one little anecdote. We got an inquiry from Harvey's of Bristol.
That's a sherry.
To launch a new product. I can't remember whether it was just another sherry or whether it was another sort of, you know, add-on or something. But anyway, off he and I went to Bristol. Well, in those days, clients, I mean, in the wine trade, I mean, the lunches, whether you got the business, was neither here nor there, but the lunches were amazing. And we went down to Bristol, and of course, into the boardroom. You know, the meeting took place. I can't remember what happened in the meeting. I think they gave us the business, actually, in the meeting. And then, oh, come to lunch, you know. So off we went to lunch. Well, even, I mean, it was not just lunch. It was a major banquet, which they did every day. In those days, every day. And we finished the meeting, came out into their car park, and my uncle said to me, "You'd better drive," he said. And he gave me the keys of his precious Rover. And I set off through Bristol. You know, I mean, heaven knows what the sort of alcohol intake would be.
No drink driving laws, of course.
No drink, no motorways, nothing like that. And I do remember we got somewhere between Bristol and Swindon, and I pulled over into a lay-by, and we slept for an hour. and then made our way back to Oxford, you know. But it was fantastic. It was a different sort of scene, really. Yes. But it was great fun.
And not necessarily to be recommended.
No, not to be recommended. But in fact, what happened was, actually, to answer your question, Tony, he made me all sorts of wonderful promises, rather like he made to his clients. And, you know, he said, right, the first thing is, because your pay will go this, and he said, I will get you a company car. Well, he didn't. And he never gave me the company car, and the pay was very slow in coming. And I got seduced by an offer from a guy I got to know in the United States when I was working for my father, who said, look, come and run this new business I'm setting up. He said, I'll pay you double what you're getting at the moment, and you can have a company. I said, you're on. You know, there was no argument. So I left. And it was great. I mean, I made a lot of money. I made, 2, 3, 4 times as much money as I was making before. But I hated the business. I just didn't enjoy it. And quite one day, I got a call from the company's accountant, auditor, CPM's auditor. Who was not working in the business, but he was up in Stoke-on-Trent or somewhere. And he said to me, look, have a meet. Anyway, cut a long story short, I rejoined the company, rejoined CPM about a year and a half after I left. And my uncle made me joint managing director, which meant, big title, not a lot of money, still didn't give me a car, but for a little while. Anyway, there I was, and things began, and we were really then moving. The company was actually motoring. We were now, into the 60s, and the markets were moving, trade was beginning to go, and things were moving. And in about 1966, I think it was, he said to me, look, he said, I'm 62, 3, I've had enough. He said, I'm tired. The war had taken a lot out of people, and it took a huge amount out of people. He was cut off really in his prime in a way by the war. The company would have been something, but in fact it was a hell of a struggle. And he said, I want to get out. And he said, I'm prepared to sell it to you. And he said, but there's only one thing. He said, he owned 51% of it, and Douglas, the sales director who got the chaps on the road, had 49%. He said, I'm not leaving the business unless you buy both of them out, or him out as well as me. So I had to look at a proposition where I had to raise a huge amount of money. I can't remember exactly what the total sum was, but it was probably somewhere about £75,000, which in that time was a lot of money. Yeah. And I had absolutely nothing. I had no money. I had about 600 quid, I think, including a handful, I think it was only about 200, Tesco shares that I'd bought for 5 pence, old money. And they had risen dramatically to 8 pence from 5. So I had to sell those, of course. But anyway, they would have been worth a fortune now. I mean, they were a millionaire. But anyway, I had a very, very good friend who was an accountant by trade, and he hadn't done what he then went on to do. And I said to him, Cecil, his name was Cecil Parkinson was his name, and I said to Cecil, Cec, I've got the opportunity to buy the business, but I've got no money. How are we going to do it? And he said, look, he said, I think it's a damn good business. He said, it's a business that you know how to run. He said, and my job is to organise the money. So I said, well, that sounds a pretty good arrangement. Anyway, to cut a long story short, about 3 months later, we managed to get the money together, and 30th of June 1967, from owning nothing in the company, I was 100% owner of CPM. So there we are. So that was it.
And Cecil, I mean, I don't know how many of you are aware of
Cecil.
I mean, now Lord Parkinson, and was Foreign Secretary and was a key player in Lady Thatcher's government, but got involved with a young lady. And the rest, as they say, is history. But he was back on our board again when we...
He was indeed,
which we'll come to.
Cecil, he's still an enormous friend of mine. He just had his 80th birthday. He's still one of the very, very few people that Margaret Thatcher, talks to. I mean, she's now very poorly, really, but he still sees her regularly. And I remember going to the Savoy for Cecil's, I don't know, whatever it was, a wedding anniversary or big birthday, and I sat next to Margaret Thatcher, and when she was fully on the ball, and by gosh, was she on the ball? Whoa, gosh, she cross-examined me.
Anyway. Probably justified.
Yeah.
So one of the big changes, I think, that you made was to change the style of the business from employing full-time, albeit tactically employed out-of-work salesmen, and started to tap into the female market. And I know that was quite a challenge, wasn't it, at the time?
It was.
Women returners.
It was, absolutely, Tony, it was. I mean, one of the reasons why I got so frustrated in the business was that the two guys who were running it then were old, they were old school. They were of their generation. And women did not go into shops to sell things or do things. I mean, they may have been behind the counter, but they certainly did not go out and do that sort of work. I mean, it was very much a man's world. And the salesmen who we were employing then, incidentally, I must just tell you, a little aside, a team, because we sold, all our work worked in teams, and an area like Manchester, we were talking about Manchester earlier, Manchester was so many team week units, and a team consisted of 4 salesmen and a supervisor. Everybody, all the salesmen worked on foot. There's no question of motor cars. They all worked on foot. They worked on a daily basis, in that they met in the morning in a cafe somewhere in the middle of Manchester with the supervisor who knew the area. Norman Bacon was the great man, the supervisor, who knew Manchester like the back of his hand. He knew every shop and store in the whole of the conurbation of Manchester. And he used to give a salesman a little piece of street map, cut out, that big, on which he knew there were 32 grocery or confectionery stores. And the salesman job was, he met at 8:30, got on the bus, went to wherever it was, and then he canvassed the stores on the patch. He had a sample from which to sell, and an order book, and a little, folder or something which told him about the product. And he came back in the evening, and he said, "Right, Mr. Bacon, I've done my 33 calls. I got 16 orders for 17 dozen or whatever it is." And all the four guys used to do the same. They'd come back in, they'd hand over the orders to Norman, and Norman would collect the stock from the we had set up little warehouses, hauliers and people used to have the stock up in the store. Norman would go the next morning, collect the stock from the warehouse, and go and deliver the orders the salesman had taken the day before for cash. That was it. No question of checks or anything like that. It was cash. So we'd collect the cash, he'd bank the cash, and he gave them another little bit of map, and for 5 days they canvassed. And they were a team of 4 and a supervisor, and the cost, I remember it vividly, the cost to the client of a team of 4 and the supervisor, including all expenses and salaries, £165. And the salesman, that included their digs, because they weren't all Mancunians working in Manchester. They in many cases, they came from London. Until Friday night, they never knew where they were going to be working the next day. So they went home, if they had a home, and the next Sunday night, they had to, or the Monday morning, they had to get down to Cardiff or to Glasgow or to wherever.
So the quality then was probably a bit mixed.
Quality was... They were itinerants. I mean, they lived where they hung their hats. They were, some of them were brilliant and bent, really.
Yes.
They were the most amazing group of people. And yet, we got products into store. We got success. But anyway, it was a huge frustration to me, this, because quality was, any good salesman, any good person, like sitting around this table here or sitting around here. I mean, they could get jobs in top-class companies and move on and had a career path and a structure and everything else. These guys were not, and it wasn't really their fault. So, I had a great argument with B. I wanted to say, look, we must employ, I think, a new force that's coming into being. And we aren't going to make anything unless we do this. And he said, no, can't do that. Absolutely out of the question. Can't have women representing the company going into stores. He said, no, that's absolutely out. Women's place is in the home. Women's place in the home. Secretaries, yes. Mothers, yes.
Nurses.
Nurses, but not sales. No, that's not on. So anyway, that was a big falling out, really. And as soon as I got hold of the company, I knew that this is where we were going to go. And we had a battle, because, of course, nobody had done it, you see, then. There was nobody had done it. And the clients, of course, I mean, they didn't understand it or believe it, that it could happen. And the very first big job I remember getting was with a company called Colgate-Palmolive, who still exist. Are they clients now? No? Could be, should be. Go back and talk to them. Because they launched a toothpaste called Ultra Bright, and it still exists.
Yes, it does.
And they launched it in the London television area. And I remember going to talk to the product manager in New Oxford Street, that's where their offices were. And he was a chap called Stephen Garman.
Oh.
And Stephen Garman later became the managing director of Norman, Craig and Cummell, big agency.
Yeah.
And he was then fairly lowly. And I said to him, Stephen, I think we ought to have a team of sales girls out. doing this job. He said, oh, that sounds interesting. So I said, I'm convinced that we can put together a team of sales girls in the London television area that will do the job. And he said, well, hedge the bet, he said. I said, okay, we'll put a team of men, traditional team of men, into north of the Thames, and we'll have a team of women south of the Thames. So we had about 20 guys, 24 guys in the north of London, and about 25 girls in the south of London. But he said, there's one thing that you're going to have to do, because I've got to persuade my sales director that this is going to happen. And he said, you will have to underwrite the potential failure of the sales girls in the south of London. He said, because if it doesn't work, he said, I'm for the high jump, he said. And so I said, I'm so confident that I will happily underwrite it. So I underwrote the cost. In other words, doing it all again and paying for it, well, what happened?
The girls are great.
The girls were great. Mind you, I spent more time in South London than I did in North London. But the girls absolutely did the business. And that was really it, really. And then we were able, you see, to use that as a case history, and we were able to talk to other clients, and we were away.
Yeah. I mean, it was absolutely game-changing.
A seminal moment.
Yeah. Almost created the industry that we have today.
Yeah. And we had, you see, two big competitors then. There's a company called Salesforce Limited. I mean, do they still exist?
No.
Nope.
No.
Salesforce Limited, lovely name. Salesforce Limited, run by a chap called Rudy Goldsmith, who was a real antagonist. He and my uncle they hated one another with a deep loathing, because they were always in competition. And the other company was a company called Commando Sales, run by a chap called Carl Brunner, and he had agencies as well, and he had the big Circular Distributors was his company. That was where he made all his money. But they were the only two competitors, and Salesforce Limited were first. They were always the number one company. CPM was sort of second, and Commando Sales were third. And my big ambition was to knock Rudy off his perch, which we did very quickly, because Rudy was old school. He didn't get into the girls, He didn't get into girls like I got into girls. So
good advice
it was,
there, boys.
but it was a huge moment, really, and that's when things really started to move.
And so into the 70s, you did a bit of hiring.
Yeah, we did hiring. We moved the business. We were in Oxford in the 60s. We moved to Woodstock, next to the Bear Hotel, into a lovely Queen Anne house in about 1964, which actually was the key, really, to me buying the business, because when I bought the business, I bought the property as well, and we sold it and leased it back. This was Cecil at work, and eventually, in 70, sold Woodstock to the Bear Hotel, and I've been back to the Bear Hotel since, and I have slept in what was my old office. Not that I didn't sleep in it before, but it's now a very comfortable bedroom. Next to bed. And then we moved. We grew out of that. We moved. We needed somewhere to go to Thame, and I was living in Brill, which is not far from Thame, and we thought, we didn't need to be in London, so we'll find some land, which we did, because there were no offices then, no motorway, no train station, nothing like that. So we bought an old coal yard on the far side of Thame. Tony will remember it. And we built an office there in 71. And then in the 70s, things really started to take off. The business really started to motor. Thanks largely to all the wonderful people that I was able to engage.
I was hoping you were going to talk about that.
To help me, because one couldn't do it on one's own. So that was when I got some lovely people involved in helping me to develop the business. The total of head office staff we had in Oxford was about 6, and then in Woodstock was about 12, I suppose. It was about 12, and then we had a big field force then. I mean, if we had 60 or 70 people out in the field, that was pretty good. I mean, we had to sort of break even, really, to sort of pay the overheads and keep the show on the road. We needed to have about 35 minimum, really, out and about in the field. And some every now and again we got a huge job. And most of these jobs, I mean, they were all tactical. There was nothing that went on for more than a few weeks, really. But when we got a big job that lasted for sort of 2 months, I mean, that was with maybe 100 people involved, and that was seriously big stuff. You know, we were all rubbing our hands with glee, really.
And it was in the mid-70s that you won the Johnson Wax business, of course, which moved the business.
Anthony Bracking was the name of the man.
Anthony Larry Bracking.
Yes, absolutely. We were asked. We had one little sort of contract job, which was sort of 12-month job, which with an organisation called Food and Wine from France. I don't know whether they still exist. When we had, because a lot of the stuff coming in from France then was, you know, people didn't know much about sort of, you know, French food and cheeses and so on and so on. And we got a bit of a job. We had about 4 people working on that. And on the strength of that, we got this chance to put a team together of well, you know it well, Tony. We put a team together for Johnson Wax, which was a contract team, and of course they were slightly nervous to start with, and I think we started off with a sort of 3 months, 6 months, and it worked, and that's the great thing. We produced the results, and then it went on from that.
And it was the first major contract sales operation, although we talked about it as merchandising. And there were 55 part-time ladies managed by 5 30-hour-a-week supervisors managed by me, when I joined the business, paid at the miserly rate of the time, rather like Richard was paid at a miserly rate at his time, part of the culture of the business, I suppose. Wow. And that was a really another milestone along the way, wasn't it?
Huge.
Because it suddenly gave us that regular cash flow, regular income.
Absolutely. And of course we were able. And the other thing which was really interesting also was that the guy who hired us, this chap, Tony Bracking, at Johnson Wax, was so proud of us because it was a real feather in his cap that he was achieving what he was achieving through another company, and he felt really good about it and was very happy, not only just to talk about it, but also if we needed, you know, with a potential new client to say, well, just ring up Tony Bracking and he'll tell you how good we are, and he was very happy to do that, and that was a huge help for us.
Again, a sea change, and I was the first executive who was hired, and I was called account executive, which I thought was a very grand name, and I did get a company car, albeit a second-hand. To be dedicated to a client. So that was the first time we had that size of ongoing team, first time we had dedicated client handlers. And of course that was part of the reason that we were able to win the Mars business in 1980.
Indeed it was. In 1980, Mars came along and they had a huge field force, I mean a massive field force, because they used to sell in and out from, then, you see, in the 80s still, a huge number of independent stores. There was still a lot. And their salesmen, used to do that job. They used to call on them every 8 weeks, and they'd sell in and they'd
deliver direct.
They
did direct to the stores.
Yes, they did. So, and then somebody in the Mars organisation said there's got to be a better and a less expensive way of doing this. And so they decided to look at recruiting an outside force. Sales director was a chap called Don Reed, and Don Reed got us in, and he got in another company in, run by a chap called Rob Ellett. What was that called? What was it called?
Ellett.
Ellett. Marketing. Anyway, Rob Ellett. And we had an absolute ding-dong battle with Rob Ellett's business, and basically got the business. Now the business then was actually relatively small, and Mars started us off, and we did this famous test in Swindon, didn't we, Tony? Do you remember?
We did. First of all, we took on their own employed part-time lady merchandisers.
We did. You're quite right. They had a few lady merchandisers. Yeah. We took on. Had about 30, didn't they?
Well, slightly more, but yeah.
Anyway, we took on their lady merchandisers, and we did that, and then we developed a concept between us, which again was really life-changing, seminal moment. We developed a concept between us, which was called neighbourhood merchandising. Now, I mean, neighbourhood merchandising is part of the vernacular, isn't it now? I mean, people understand it, it's just neighbourhood merchandising. But it was a completely new idea, really. But what we recruited, you see, were people who lived on the spot and worked in the area in which they lived. And they worked maybe 5 miles radius or 10, or depending on if it was rural or urban or whatever. And they had their little cars and they moved around. And we designed the territories to fit the staff. So we could, and we also had then a lot of, our key players really were the young married women who maybe had one child, who had to get them into school, and then they had to pick them up from school. And so we designed jobs really round the people. We said, look, you can start work at 9:15 in the morning, and you can knock off at 3:15 and pick the kids up. And of course, when you think about it logically, there aren't very many retail shopkeepers, and there were still lots of, and this was independents, principally independent, who actually want to see anybody to sell them anything before 9:30 in the morning. They're busy with the newspapers and busy with people going to work and so on. So 9:15 was a good time to start. And they just worked straight through lunch hour, did 5 hours, 8 hours, or whatever it was a day, 3 days a week, 4 days a week, 2 days a week, or whatever it was.
And we were able, weren't we, to get a disproportionately high quality of people, because we designed the job and engineered the territory to precisely fit the needs of the people. Yeah. So women returners coming back into the marketplace, and we were able to get a disproportionately high level of loyalty and outcomes we talk about now for the cost. Yeah. And it drove, we won that in 1980. We started work in 1980. And within the next 5 years, we've got 5 or 6 clients doing similar things. The Azure, for example, was one. And it drove the business.
It did, Tony. And you see, with Mars, Mars had a terribly tough reputation back in the 70s and 80s. I mean, they were regarded as being ogres. People paid a lot of money, but they demanded the world. And people were quite frightened of them, and companies like us were pretty well terrified of them, really, because we were, it was sort of, if you work for them, you might work for a week and you'll be fired. If you're not good enough, you'll be fired. We found exactly the opposite.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely the opposite. They were incredibly good. They were very supportive. They worked with us, and from very early days, we had Mars people working within our business. We worked on a very simple cost-plus basis. They knew exactly how much we paid the staff, how much profit we were making. It was a very open book ledger.
In fact, we designed Brian Trotman, who some of you may have come across. He's retired from full-time work in the business, still does some projects, particularly in Asia. He developed this concept, which we call open ledger costing, which again drove the business for 20 years. It's a bit too open now in procurement. Now know every last decimal point about our money. But in those days, again, it was CPM innovating again.
It was new. It was absolutely new. And I remember talking to one of our competitors, and he said, "You can't work like that." He said, you can't have your clients knowing how much money you're making. I said, well, the proof of the pudding's in the eating. This is the way we'd done it, and you were here, and now you're here, and we were here, and we're now here, and that was it. We just surged to the top, of the market. And there was no great brilliance about it. It seemed like common sense really at the time, but it made a huge difference. And Mars, when we really grew the business hugely with them, because we started off in a relatively small way, and of course the key for them was knocking hell out of Cadbury and Rowntree, and they knew they'd got this competitive edge, which was us really, and they thought, right, if we're going to make this work, we've got to get out there nationally quickly. And we went from having, I don't know whether it was 100 or 70 or whatever it was, and we went to a field force of 1,200 people from one end of the nation to the other in a matter of about 6 or 8 months. I mean, it was absolutely massive recruitment job, helped by them, but it was terrific, very, very stimulating, pretty exhausting, but once it was done brilliantly.
I think when people say how did CPM get to its market-leading position, I mean, Richard's actually touched on it. We've always managed to attract good quality people, better than the industry average, and they have good common sense, good judgment. You apply good common sense and judgment, and it's amazing how good things happen as a consequence. And we never overcomplicate it. We sometimes, in today's world where we're just challenged by so much information and data, we sometimes overcomplicate things. Martin and I were at an event last week, interestingly, with an old Mars guy, with Alan Layton, and he was talking about the success of businesses. Successful businesses decomplex, not deconstruct, but decomplex their business processes. And so simplicity means that you can do it better. KISS, that's right.
KISS. Keep it simple, stupid.
So we drove this. We didn't call it outsourcing. We hadn't thought of that. We drove whatever it was during the first half of the 80s, and then you decided that we were going to get into the world of corporate.
Well, I suppose yes. It was. We were doing well. I mean, the company was doing well. We needed. We began to look at buying things and doing things with others. We had a smaller competitor in London called Field Promotion Services, FPS, and run by a chap called Michael Pope. And we were getting to the stage where we started to get conflict of interest. We couldn't work for X because CPM, we couldn't work for X because we were already working for Y. And so FPS provided us with an alternative. And CPM now spawns new companies about one a week, to take on, other competitive stuff. Or when I say CPM, Omnicom does, I suppose, not CPM. But, one way or another, it's inspired by CPM. But that was the way that we thought then. So we took on FPS, and they were much smaller and pretty sort of old style, shall we say? Yes. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but anyway, we had quite a. I don't think we integrated them brilliantly, but we
purposely didn't. I didn't want to say we, you. Yeah. Michael Pope, who was the managing director, was an extraordinary eccentric.
Still is.
Just amazing. And he was fiercely independent. And the reason that he wanted to join forces with us was he saw this was a way of him marketing his business on the stock market, and was instrumental in persuading you, I think, to do that.
Yeah, we had an opportunity. There was a market that existed then, a stock market, small stock market called the USM, unlisted securities market, and that was what really AIM is sort of now. The AIM market was for smaller companies, and there was the unlisted securities market for companies with a market capitalization of whatever. It wasn't huge, but it was big enough to sustain and big enough for there to be an interest. And the great thing about being on the market was, of course, that you could actually raise cash. If you needed to raise cash, you could go to the shareholders who became, because other people bought into the company. Obviously, pension funds and other things, as they do with it. It was a full stock market set up, really. And it also enabled us to do one other thing, which was quite attractive, you know, when one had been battling away on relatively sort of low levels of personal income. We were able to capitalize on the value of our business. So, in fact, by this time, Tony and Brian, Trotman and Chris Madge and Jim Addison were all shareholders in the business. And so we were able to effectively capitalize to a degree on that. And so, you know, we passed go, we went to the market, the USM, with a market capitalization of about 12 million at that time, and good profit record, which we had to have, and so on and so on. And so we did that. And that was, again, a big moment, really. It was a big moment.
And I remember being on the floor of the London stock market. I think it was around the 25th of September 1985, and seeing CPM shares being traded. I'm thinking, wow, and we placed, I can't remember, 125 or 120 or
I think
something.
125.
And they drifted up over that first day by 2 or 3 points. But of course,
and then drifted down again.
Well, it did, and and of course well, you tell the story, Richard. I mean, we ended up having to make 1 or 2 changes.
Yeah, well, what we did then was a number of things happened, because the 80s, the mid 80s particularly, were high excitement. I mean, companies were being bought and sold on an almost weekly basis. I mean, companies were taking. I mean, the acquisitions and mergers business was absolutely flat out. And what was happening then was that marketing services, and we were sort of on the edge of it really, because we were, nobody quite knew what we did really, but we were sort of a funny little thing on the side here. But advertising agencies were becoming more acquisitive, fully listed companies were becoming like Bose Massimi, Abbott Mead Vickers, various companies like this were becoming, they said, well, gosh, we've got to grow. So it's difficult to grow in advertising. So what do? We must look on the fringes. And so they were looking at other companies to acquire. Now we had a lot of business at that time with a very successful agency in the West End called Davidson, Pierce, Berry and Spottiswoode.
Fantastic.
They had been Davidson, Pierce, Berry and Tuck, and they had 1 or 2 cracking accounts. They had the most visible of them all was Brook Bond, and the PG Tips and the chimpanzees. Remember the chimps? That was Davidson Pierce, and they were doing extremely well with those. They had Cunard. They had some lovely accounts, and we did quite a lot of work with them, and we got to know them extremely well. And they were looking to develop their business because they were on the stock market, fully listed, with a very wide shareholding. In other words, no one director had more than really a handful of shares. And anyway, that was by the way, but we got talking. And to cut a long story short, technically speaking, they took over CPM. But in the event, it so happened that when all the dust had settled, the CPM shareholders had a much greater grip of the business in terms of shares than they did themselves, because a lot were with pension funds and so on and so on. So between us, we were with David Smith. It wasn't, I have to say, a particularly happy marriage. We bought a little design company called Tyrrell.
Gosh,
that was a failing design company, and why I did it, I can never. It was my fault entirely.
Correct.
But anyway, we did. We bought this little company that was, and anyway, but the actual marriage, in a way, started to fail not because of us, but because Davis and Pierce began to lose business. Now, as you know, in agencies, accounts come and accounts go. And suddenly, a lot of their business started to disappear. And they became weaker. And there was another advertising agency around the corner, who I knew quite well, called Bose Massimi Pollitt, BMP. And BMP had a look at Davis and Pearce and thought, hang on, this company is not going to go anywhere, and if we make a strategic move, we can snap them up. And that's exactly what happened. Bose Massimi went for Davis and Pearce. Davis and Pearce were weak. We, and that's the CPM element, felt much more comfortable with Bose Massimi Pollitt team than we did with a rather failing Davis and Pearce team. The whole thing was done. It was an agreed takeover. And so Davis and Pearce effectively disappeared within a week, practically. Virtually the whole management team, bar about two. Simon Yardley stayed on a bit, but because he did Brook Bond. But basically, Davis and Pearce disappeared off the map. But CPM suddenly became a sort of flagship marketing services company within the Bose Massimi group. And Bose Massimi Pollitt had, because they were likewise looking to buy new companies. And the first acquisition they made was a company called Granby. Granby mean anything to you?
Nobody would know Granby.
Nobody would know Granby? You would know Granby, up in Warrington. And Granby Marketing Services was bought by Bose Massimi Pollitt for a ridiculous sum of money, because the company was basically, it had a wonderful, wonderful client called Kellogg's. And every single little didgeridoo, things in the Kellogg's packets or the things on the back of them, send for this, send for that, this, that, and the other, that was all done by Granby Marketing Services. And Granby milked Kellogg's. And it was absolutely a fantastically profitable business. I think for every pound they turned over, 60 to 70 pence was profit. I have to say at the same time, it was worked out of a terrible dingy warehouse on the side of a canal in Warrington. And the staff were underpaid and they were incredibly poorly looked after. And most of them were nearly the criminal classes. When I say that, believe me, they had two guys, they had two men and one woman who were ex-prison warders who were on security. And when the staff left in the evening at the end of their shift, they were body searched because they were taking, the only way they could supplement their income was to nick a few bits and pieces and take them out. So they went through this horrific, well, you can imagine it was a company laced with problems. Bose Massimi really didn't know what they'd bought. They paid a huge amount of money for it. And of course, as soon as the two proprietors went off, one went to Jersey and the other one went to the Isle of Man and were never seen again. And they also had a marketing recruitment business, and they had a marketing consultancy business run by Jonathan Chris, remember him, Tony? And these companies, they didn't know what to do. They said, Morris Adams, they said, you know about marketing services, you better be chairman of that lot. You can have marketing and try and make something of that. And of course you know a bit about CPM as well. So I became deputy chairman or chairman of the marketing services group on the Bose Massimi board. CPM, as always, delivering, growing, under new, Tony was there by that. We've missed out a whole lot of things, haven't we, Tony?
Time.
TMG and this and that and the other. But we'd got a real thing going on CPM, and CPM was never failed to deliver its profit target. It just kept motoring. I then took on this group of ramshackle companies and tried to do something with them. Some good, some bad. And pushed on, and there we were, cracking along, and suddenly, out of the blue, we got Martin Bose, who was there, the chairman of Bose Massimi Pollitt, he got a fax or something, or a telephone call from a tiny French advertising agency saying, "We're bidding for you."
Fantastic.
Martin said, "Well, who are you?" And they said, "Well, we're a company called Boulet-Drew Dupuis BDDP." They were called.
Yeah.
BDDP. They were a Paris agency. They were about a quarter the size of Bays Massimi Pollitt in London, but they had the backing of Société Générale, Crédit Agricole, the Bank of Japan, a couple of American banks, and they'd raised an enormous amount. They'd obviously a charismatic chairman who'd said, "Look, we've got to be global."
Jean-Claude Boulet-Drew.
Jean-Claude Boulet-Drew, and he said, we're going to buy the business and we're going to pay a lot of money for it. Well, Martin, who was nothing if not forthright.
Not this Martin. Martin Bowes.
Martin Bowes.
Chairman of
Martin
Bowes.
Bowes. And the rest of us, we said, no, this is not for us. This is not for us at all. And so we fought a big defence, and we fought them off, and we fought them off. But they kept coming back with a bit more money and a bit more money, and they were very aggressive. But it would not have been the right thing for the company. And Martin's famous defence document, which went out to all the shareholders, had a cartoon on the front and a one-liner, "Frog off." And so "Frog off" went out to the shareholders, and the shareholders listened. But Martin had got a very good, he got lots of very good connections. He was a very experienced advertising man. Still going strong. Martin just had his 80th birthday. We both saw him the other week. Other day. Hasn't changed a bit. And Martin had a very good contact with a New York business, New York advertising agency that had just come together, run by a chap called Crawford. And basically, it was two agencies who got together because of the threat of an Englishman who had a company called WWP. Everybody knows about them?
WPP.
WPP, I beg your pardon, Martin Sorrell. And Martin Sorrell, who was really, he bought J. Walter Thompson, he was really motoring. And they could see, these Americans, that he was a real serious threat. So they put their two agencies together over there in order to consolidate and fight off the WPP threat. So Martin went to talk to Bruce Crawford. Bruce Crawford access to the money, and basically we did a deal. I remember it vividly. In the middle of the night, I got a call at 11:30 p.m. on a Sunday night. "Richard, can you come to a board meeting up in Paddington where the offices were?" So I got in the car and drove up, got there about 1:30, and then we had this meeting because it was American times, and they had to open their stock exchange in the morning. Anyway, we did the deal. The deal was done, and we became part of this new grouping that was called Omnicom. Omnicom, and that was Omnicom. So
we had 4 years. It was 1989 that was done.
Yeah.
So we went from being a private business to a public business, to part of Davidson Pierce, to part of BMP, to Omnicom in that sort of 4.5 year period.
Yeah.
And along the way, we acquired our major competitor, which was
Yeah.
a business that had been started by two ex-Mars guys,
Yeah.
and absorbed that into Tame.
That was not comfortable, was it?
That was a difficult time,
Yeah.
and as Richard moved into the chairman of the BMP Marketing Services Group, I sort of followed him through, and we did have a few challenges there, but we came through into the 90s. Significantly the leading company of our type in the UK, completely dominant. Yeah. Even to the point where people like Rob Elliott, we talked to him about buying his business, and he's still a good friend actually. and the business was strong. I'm just conscious that we've got 15 minutes, shall I just talk a bit about the 90s?
Do, yes, absolutely.
Sorry, just wanted to delay by 15 to give us 30.
Well, let's
see how it goes.
See how we go. Actually, just before I talk a bit about the 90s, which will be very brief because my memory is not good. Has anybody got any questions for Richard? Because Richard, although JB Edgerton started the business, Richard's style and culture still, I believe, permeates the business now. The belief in investing in good people, driving them very hard, expecting a lot of them, but backing their judgment, being very honest and open in the way that the business engages with its clients, striving to do the best possible thing for clients, and always being prepared to go that extra mile. I mean, those things that you did are still in the business now.
I think you're flattering me now, Tony.
Well,
I wasn't that good.
You can give me the tenner that you owed me for 50 years later. But if he wasn't the founder, he's pretty much the father of the culture of the business. Have you got any questions for Richard? Now's a good time to ask them before I start wittering.
Saatchis were very acquisitive, but they were acquisitive in advertising terms. The Saatchi brothers actually weren't terribly interested in the peripheral stuff. They were a very creative pair. But Martin Sorrell had a much wider vision, in my view, than the Saatchis, in the sense that he could see actually there was extremely good money to be made, because he's a money man. I mean, Martin Sorrell would not in any way describe himself as a creative advertising man. He's a brilliantly good manager, and he could see there was money to be made in other businesses, research businesses and this and that and the other. So his canvas was wider. Saatchi was advertising, and look what happened to the Saatchis. I mean, they've had a pretty checkered career, really. I mean, they've done quite well, but compared with him, nothing. They were sort of iconic, I mean, and of course Charles was and still is more interested in his art collection really now than.
Of course, Martin Sorrell was finance director to Saatchi and Saatchi.
Yep.
And he left to set up, and he bought WPP, which was wire and plastic products.
Wire and plastic products,
which made supermarket baskets.
Yeah.
And one of the first businesses that he acquired was a company in Oxfordshire, in Kidlington, called VAP, which was a print business. Sadly, the guy who runs it is now dead. But Rich is quite right. The DDB and BBDO, which were the two agencies that came together to form Omnicom, were worried that a British advertising agency might take them on. Yeah. And it was a heady time. I mean,
it was a heady time. And also, in fact, one of the reasons why they were keen to do the deal in the new sort of Omnicom umbrella was because Doyle Dane Bernbach, DDB, had got big management problems in London, and they could see themselves slipping away or under threat, and they could see in Bose Massimi a homegrown British management structure that could actually sort out DDB, and that's why BMP became BMP DDB. Basically, so that we could do something about that. And so
there's an irony that DDB London had just acquired Adam and Eve. I don't know if you saw that earlier this year, and put them together for exactly the same reason: weak management.
I wish Omnicom was quick making decisions and acquisitions these days.
The Omnicom make very quick decisions if their feet are on the fire. And I think they were with DDB.
Sorry, there's one last question.
Yes,
very interesting. Following the Mad Men series, which highlights this era.
Yeah. Have you seen that show, Richard? Mad Men?
No. Should I?
Martin gave me a box set of the very funny.
It's a New York agency which begins to flourish in the 60s, and it remembers the first time a photocopy is delivered to the office, and all the secretaries are going to go on strike, and it's just a marvellous reflection of the era, and the acquisitions part of and
Yeah.
growth of consumer brands.
Yes.
It's wonderful.
Well,
wonderful.
yeah. You see, it was very different. I mean, the communications then that one had in those sort of early days were extraordinary, really. I mean, you know, we worked. Talk about snail mail. I mean, you know, there weren't computers. There was not. It wasn't even. They weren't even heard of. So everything was done by telephone, and then we had this incredible new invention, you know, which was the fax thing that started to come through, and then, you know, that was a really revolutionary, and it was all done at a different sort of pace, and everything was done by letter. You know, and letters moved, you know, at a pace and so on. I mean, the Royal Mail was, I have to say, are they clients of CPM, by the way,
Yes.
Royal
Yes,
Mail?
they are, yeah.
The Royal Mail, they made it, and incidentally, did you hear that what the
Yeah.
profits were tonight?
Record
Yeah.
profits.
They've suddenly really started to take off. But very interesting. But the Royal Mail, you know, used to just deliver the post the following day. There was never a question of first class or second class then. It was everything was first class, and it worked. But that was the way the system was. And the telephone, it was quite sort of proper. Not that everybody was honest, because I'm sure there's just as many dishonest people around then as there are probably now. But, you know, it was a different pace.
Although people used to work incredibly long hours, I mean, we used if we weren't in the office by 7 o'clock, it was a late start. And if we were away, I always remember if I could listen to the Archers on the drive home, so if I left the office at about 7 o'clock, that was an early night. And we used to have little dictaphones that we would dictate the letters, and then the secretary in the morning would transcribe from all these tapes, except for Richard, of course, who always had a secretary who was short. That's the...
She did shorthand.
It,
As does Diana now.
as does Diana now, still does, which is... So we came into the 90s, part of Omnicom, with tired actually through the 80s, because it was a
Tough time.
hard work, but very, very successful. And with the business, the UK business, totally dominant and conflicted again. So we were working for all the major clients in the sectors we wanted to work for. And so we reviewed how to go forward, and we started to look at new sectors. So we started to look at utilities and financial services, look at new services, one of which was telemarketing, as we called it then. And we bought, or in fact we acquired from Omnicom, a business called Newbury Marketing, which was a small tele business based in Newbury, which we brought into Tame. And then geographically, we said we could develop geographically by building our business on the back of existing clients. And so through the 90s, we built our European business. The UK business continued to grow and to thrive, particularly on the back of utility companies. We changed the organisation. We formed a mini group and created the UK as a separate business, which Eddie Phillips, who's still in the business, ran. And the European expansion formed the basis of the global platform that we have today, that Newbury Marketing organisation, which was tiny, it was about 3 people. And Vanessa Hartnell came, and who's something that you guys won't know, Martin, but, came into the business at that time. Now is a significant contributor to the UK business. I mean, call centres, a major part of the UK business. And those utilities businesses, people like BT, although we're not working for them now, co-sign kind of where we started to flirt with the idea of creating alternative brands again. We'd had FPS in the 80s. We now have co-sign and TRO in the whatever we are now, in the tweenies or whatever. So the 90s was about European development and trying to create dominant positions in all the European markets. And we did that. And again, the UK business, absolutely at the heart of the organisation, driving the profit, bringing people in who populated some of the thinking, and our new partners, as we built businesses in Belgium. You remember the boys in Belgium?
Boys in Belgium.
In France, would come to the UK, they'd spend a few days in the business, take ideas back and implement them in the markets. And the final European deal we did was in Germany in the late 90s.
It wasn't
PPD.
It wasn't all roses, was
No,
it?
and that was a challenge.
Yeah.
That was a challenge. And
Yeah.
it is.
Yes.
Funnily enough, it is.
Yeah.
15 years
Yeah.
on,
Yeah.
a number of people have tried to fix that.
Yeah.
So as we came into the noughties, the sort of the new millennium, we were trying to figure out really what's our offer, how are we going forward, and we believe that integrating a number of different mediums, a number of different media, so field and phone, and the early days of email, we weren't really into the full digital thing then, was that, so we talked about having an integrated media offer, which we're still struggling to get now. And it's fascinating. The last 10 years or so have been about figuring out, I think, what CPM really is. We decided we were a sales business, and so our new, or relatively new, Inside Influence and Sales strat plan and brand promise informs that. We know that data is important. And I mean, I remember, do you remember you Brian, and I going to IBM? We went to IBM when we bought our first computer. That was in the 80s. How somebody like Richard or I would be allowed to buy a computer, I have no idea, but we did. but we've always had a lot of data. And we're now learning that there's a hierarchy of data to information to wisdom, and that wisdom really is what we describe as insights. So the point that I make really is that we've been on a journey, and that journey continues. And that journey is supported by the people that work in the business. And the one key factor in the success of CPM, really from as long as I know, and I think Richard would share it, is the quality of the people that we attract and retain in the organisation. And although we lose the odd person that we don't want to lose, in the main we keep the people that will make a difference. And the people that make a difference in our business are people with the attitude that can do things, the glass half full people, optimists, positive people, people who want to give rather than to take, people who believe that client service is actually a strength rather than a weakness. A service-minded approach to life is really something that gives you competitive edge in the market, and we engage our clients in a way that other clients, other organisations don't. And the Omnicom organisation, we were quite a long way from the brain in those early days. In fact, Omnicom didn't really know that CPM was part of BMP. They bought that business for the London agency, and they kind of discovered
we were an add-on, really, weren't we?
That's right, and we didn't. They didn't really bother with us for years.
Yeah.
Now we are reporting directly into New York. CPM is, we think, about number 3. Certainly, it's in the top 5 DAS businesses. DAS is over half of the income of Omnicom. Yeah, so we're a very strong player now in the market, but predicated on those same basic principles of great people doing great work for great clients, and always finishing just in time before dinner. There. I hope you found that interesting. I mean, any other?
Oh yeah, please. Any other questions? I mean, we're delighted to try and answer them.
Yeah.
Just regarding your clients during all this change, particularly the 4.5 years where you're from a private company to a public, how did they react to the completely different?
Well, I think they were quite proud of us, really. I mean, when we, they felt that they had a contributory part of our success. And they said, of course, you mustn't get too big-headed, and of course you're now, you've made more money than we're going to make. And they had their little go at us, few little digs. But I don't think they weren't unhappy about us at all. I think they felt that they were working with the best. I mean, because we were the only company of our sort that had actually made it to that level. And so they felt they had a part of building us into that success. And they were not at all unhappy about it, I don't think, were they, Tony? No, they were.
When Davis and Pierce, we became part of Davis and Pierce, Mars were about 40% of our business at that time.
They were.
and they made Davis and Pearce resign the then Roundtree business. It was a small amount of business there, part of Nestle now. But that was the only issue. I think they were absolutely fine about it.
They were. No, they were pretty good. And the great thing, you know, it's wonderful really when you think back to Mars. Mars came, I mean, forgetting the pre-war bit, because nobody could remember that after the war. But you know, the fact that CPM has been involved with Mars since just before 1980, and that's now 32, 35, you know, that length of time. And that's without a break, because they've all, whether, I don't know how many people are involved in Mars at CPM now, but
500 or 600.
Well, you know, it's still a big part, and it'll go up, and it'll go down a bit. But I mean, the fact is that we're part of their culture now.
And longevity of clients. I mean, Kellogg have been a client first of Granby and now of CPM for over 50 years. And we've been
I must do, whilst you're just talking about...
No, go on.
I was saying about Granby. Of course, when I went to Granby, you can imagine, I mean, I told you the horrific story of Granby by the canal there. And I used to go up every Monday, or I think it was, up to Warrington, and I went with a heavy heart really, because it was pretty daunting. But the one thing that I managed to do was to persuade a young accountant called Tom Preece. Have you ever heard of him? Yeah? Tom Preece, who was working for a firm of accountants in Liverpool, to come and become the finance director. And I don't think he really knew what he was letting himself in for. But anyway, he came, and that was the beginning, actually, of I would say normalising Granby, but bringing it into the 20th century a bit. So Tom Preece was a hugely valuable asset, really, that we gained from there. And Tony was talking about people. I mean, just briefly, I mean, the four guys that joined CPM in the 70s, I mean, apart from Tony, as you reminded me, came in 75, a guy called Jim Addison who started, because we had a concept in the 70s of the complete sales promotion company, not just field marketing and all that, but also sales promotion, creativity. And Jim was and is a very creative guy. And so, and Jim needed his own sort of head really, because he was a bit bored with, you know, running teams in the field. And so I said to him, well, why don't we just set up this thing, Jim, and you run it. You become the boss, and you can go downstairs in the corner, which he did, and he set up his own little personal fiefdom down there. And, you know, he had a very successful little business, and it made never lost money, never made huge amounts. But Jim joined us, and Jim then went on to become the boss of a company called
Specialist Publications.
Specialist Publications in Wales that came to Bristol, which was part of one of the many companies that were bought by BNP. He went on there. There was a guy called Chris Madge, whose name is probably totally unfamiliar to most of you. Chris was a brilliant tactical manager. He ran all the tactical stuff, basically, in CPM. And sometimes he produced miracles. Most of the time he produced miracles. How he did it, I never quite wanted to ask sometimes.
And if those of you who are working on the field side of the business, if you talk to Sandra Thress in recruitment, Sandra Thress will tell you all about Chris
Madge. But Chris, you see, he joined us in, he was telling me, 77, 8, and he came from a competitor called 2001 Promotions. You can tell when they were started. So he came there. And then the other absolutely crucial person that I was able to persuade, I remember doing it, it was a Saturday morning when we were in the other building in Thame, and we had the accountants to the company then were a company called Wen Townsend, who were in Oxford, and the partner who we worked with was a chap called Peter Smith. And I said to Peter, we've got a disastrous financial manager in the business, because we didn't have a chartered accountant then. We couldn't afford one. We had sort of chaps that were so-called finance managers, but most of them were useless. And we were really in need of somebody decent to manage the money. And I said to Peter Smith, Peter, can you help me out? I need to get somebody really good in to do this job. Have you got anybody in mind? Well, he said, I've got a young assistant, he said. He's only 21 or 22, and he's just passed his finals. He went straight through all the exams, and he said, he's the one guy I've got. He said, he's miles younger than most of them. He said, if I need to do an investigation or need a tax problem or something like that sorted out, he said, this is the man I send to do it. He said, he wants to leave us, but he wants to go and join another, he wants to go out of the chartered accountancy world, and he wants to go into the world of manufacturing or a business rather than just doing. But he wants to join a big business where he can get experience. I said, how good is he, Peter? And he said, he's very good. But he said, I don't think he'll want to come to you. He said, because you're too small. So I said, well, let us try. If he's that good, let us try. And I remember Jim Addison and I, sitting down on Saturday morning in Tame Park Road, and I've never sold anybody, I think, apart from Tony, to join us, so hard as I did with this young chap, who was very quiet, very different, and very reserved. You couldn't tell what he was thinking, really. Was he going to, wasn't he going to? And I said, I think this is a great opportunity for you. A chap called Brian Trotman. And Brian, does everybody know Brian?
Probably not.
No, probably not. Really, it's very interesting.
Most of his work now is in Asia.
Is in Asia, yeah.
But Brian joined us as our sort of finance director, and it was an absolutely, I don't call it a master stroke, because it wasn't, I didn't really know it was going to be so successful, but he was absolutely fantastic. And he kept us all on the straight and narrow.
And he's keeping India and China and Vietnam on the straight and narrow now, working into
He's absolutely terrific. And I have to tell you, one of the things we had, this is just a little anecdote. Okay. I'll finish on this if you like, because it's actually relevant to today.
Okay, well, I've
today.
got two
You've got two.
That I must tell you.
Okay, well, this is an anecdote. When we went public, when we actually floated the company on the stock market, Brian's called us all together. He said, I need to have a chat with all of you together. He said, if we're going to go to the stock market, he said, we've got to be absolutely squeaky clean. He said, we've got to have an absolutely brilliantly clean sheet. So we all said, yes, Brian, absolutely, Brian. He said, and I'm afraid the one thing that we are not going to be able to carry forward into our public ownership is our racehorse. And I had bought him, and then the company actually then owned him. We had a wonderfully successful steeplechaser called Duke of Milan. And the colours that Duke of Milan had were red and white, CPM colours, red and white, and a black and white sort of beaver-like hat, red and white stripes hat. And so he said, I'm afraid the Duke of Milan is going to have to go. So I said, Brian, the Duke of Milan can't go. He said, well, he's going to have to go from the company. He said, you're going to have to buy him. So actually, I bought the Duke of Milan from the company. But I have to tell you that those colours, when I retired from the business and we sold, the horse left the company, I took over the colours, and I've raced the colours ever since. And today, at Huntingdon Racecourse, those same colours didn't quite win, but they finished a very close second. And so they live on.
Richard's career, I mean, if we had more time, I'd tell you, as a racehorse owner, is always not quite winning.
Duke of Milan used to win.
Duke won.
Seriously good.
Yeah, the Duke won. Yeah. Trotman is, again, brings an awful lot of the discipline to CPM that we have. And before Brian came, we used to, for expenses, we used to go down and get money out of the petty cash tin. and he stopped all that, which I thought was shocking. But, so a lot of the financial processes, not the complexity that comes from Omnicom, but a lot of the financial processes are Brian's today.
And he lived, ate, slept and breathed CPM. I mean, Brian was never in the office later than about 6:30 in the morning, and he never left until about 8:30 or 9 o'clock at night. And whereas most of us were maybe drinking cups of tea, and Brian was working. I mean, he just is he's an amazing, and he's got a brilliant grasp. He's not extra, he's the most introvert chap, he's not extrovert, but there's nothing that he doesn't know about the business and the workings of the business.
When these guys go through their more advanced financial training as they climb the ranks of client service management, they'll be introduced to the well-known Trotman levers, financial levers, how to make the business tick.
Which still, and Eddie and I were doing that in Singapore 2 weeks ago, funnily enough.
I never got to Singapore and places like that.
No,
I only got as far as Brighton, I think. Maybe Paris.
We went to Amsterdam together.
We did go to Amsterdam, yes. Yeah, was only allowed there once.
But that's another story.